Welcome everybody to the 11th Dry Lab Real Science meeting. We're taking a slight break from the norm of academics presenting what they've been doing to support their students, and we're really delighted to be able to welcome, at the moment, just Leah McClure, but hopefully another teacher will be joining us very shortly, who are actually delivering the A-level curriculum to students at the moment. And I thought it would be really interesting for us to hear from the teachers' perspectives what they think the challenges that the students have faced this year are, and what they're going to continue to struggle with next year. So I'm really delighted to welcome Leah McClure, who is a biology teacher at, let me get it right, it's Colton Hills Community School in Wolverhampton. And Leah was also the Royal Society of Biology Teacher of the Year in 2017. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much for giving up the time to join us. And the floor is all yours whenever you would like.
I'm going to share, so just to give a bit of context, I'm head of biology, but I'm also head of science here. So I'm coming at this from the point of view of biology, chemistry, physics, and BTEC applied science. So I do have an overview of all the sciences and the key issues at the moment. I'm just going to share a slide. Thinking about this, I think there's 5 key areas that I'd like to share, really. The first is the most obvious, and that's the loss of lab time. So obviously during lockdown, there was an opportunity for the students to be in the lab. But also, as we've come back, you've got 2 separate issues. You've got the fact that with the bubbles, students may not have been able to get into the labs. Now, I think most schools like my own have prioritised year 11 and year 13, but that may not have been the case. And of course, once we've got back into the labs, we've had to prioritise the required practicals over everything else because of the teacher assessed grades. And that means there's a knock-on effect for a lot of things there for us. It means that obviously they don't have the skills that we'd like them to have. But apart from that, they also don't get the repetition with particular pieces of equipment. So for chemistry, for example, they've done a raft of titrations by this point. So they're proficient with the equipment. Whereas now it might be that actually we're going back to teaching them the basics of how to use a particular piece of equipment rather than them being able to engage on a deeper level with what they're doing and why they're doing it. So you've got that loss of skills, that loss of practice, and also that loss of understanding that they get when they get to the end of year 13. And actually they've spent so much time doing lab work that they're free to conduct those practicals and also think about every step along the way rather than just focusing on, oh, how do I use this? Where does this bit go? What happens here? And I think that's going to cause a massive knock-on effect in terms of how well they do in their labs in the future. I know that here, even though we're a community school, we put a large focus on the practical skills. We do a lot of practical work, and therefore we've lost a lot of our time with that, and it does show. So when the students are doing practicals now, you're having to remind them of things that in years gone by this point in their academic career, they'd be fine with, they'd already know. The second one is slightly different. This is just discussion. That's group discussion, paired discussion, just class discussion. And that's led to a set of issues. Students being able to discuss ideas and concepts, processes, means that they get the opportunity to consolidate what their thinking is. We get the opportunity to pick up on any misconceptions they've got. They work on their social skills in a professional sense and also their speaking and listening skills. And you also go into more depth in topics, whereas they've learned a lot of this content now online. Year 13 have been through 2 sets of lockdowns where the first one, the majority of schools were not delivering online lessons. The second one we were, but you're still not allowing that particular process that happens in a classroom where all of those students can kind of get together and share their thinking with each other and bounce off each other in understanding. And also the teacher isn't getting that kind of understanding of where they're at either. I think one of the biggest problems we've had in terms of the EF report at the bottom is the widening of the gap. So pupil premium disadvantaged students have been, I mean, in some cases, being really honest, their learning's been obliterated because they don't have the support at home, because they don't have the technological capabilities. Some students weren't able to engage with any of the learning because they didn't have laptops in the first instance. We were promised them by the government, and then they weren't brought out until the second lockdown, and even then it was on a rollout basis. So there is the potential that you've got some year 13s across the country who weren't able to engage with a lot of the learning that's gone on, and that gap is a problem for us. It's definitely a problem in primary, it's a problem in secondary, so obviously that is going to continue. I think one of the ones that people maybe don't think about as much is the awe and wonder, the interest in the subject. So I know from a personal point of view, teaching A-level biology, I'll take mass transporting plants. So I taught mass transporting plants during lockdown. It's a very difficult topic to get engagement with when you're teaching it via a computer, because the kind of things we would have done, so made photometers and looked at stomatal peels, all the things that we could have worked the maths into and looked at firsthand, you're showing them a video of, and therefore you've just lost that level of interest that they would normally have. And I think that is a concern. So some of the students have been switched off by this process. The topics that they were interested in and they did love are no longer as interesting for them. And I think that is a concern. And the last one, and I think the most important, and this has certainly been an issue for me today. So I've had an assessment that I delivered to year 13, and one of my girls was outside crying for 10 minutes before she came in. A lot of them are very fragile. If you take their mental state into account, they've been through multiple lockdowns now. I have some repeating students, which means they were in year 14. They've gone through this tag process once. They've chosen to stay behind, do this year again in order to improve, and then they've had to go through the process for a second time. And that's disheartening in just for any student. The process itself is stressful for them. And we are finding that a lot of them are just, I think fragile is the best word I can come up with for it. They need an awful lot of support. So I think you've got the really key skills that we haven't managed to build up in them that we'd like to normally, but then you've also got those problems of interest in the subject, areas of weakness that maybe haven't been picked up on like they normally would have. You've got the disadvantaged students, you've got that interest in the subject, and then finally just their actual mental well-being, which is going to be a problem, I think, moving forwards. And of course, the last thing to consider is all of this is relevant to year 13, but for year 12 it's also a problem. And to flag an even wider issue, I know that for my school, in terms of the bubbles, year 7, 8, 9 have no lab access this year. They've done no practical work at all, which means that moving up through the years, that's going to have a knock-on effect. Hopefully that was helpful. Sorry, it was less than positive.
The second person who talked today is from a chemistry department in Howell School in Cardiff. It's Hannah Harrison-Hughes. So Hannah, if you are able to share your screen, if you have any presentation or you'd just like to talk to us, then that would be fantastic. We'd really like to get your perspective on this as well.
Great. No, I haven't prepared anything. It was just sort of some thoughts coming off, mostly as Leah was talking there at the end. Apologies for being a bit late. For us, it's really been a sort of a tale of two halves. We found some students have actually thrived and come on more than we thought they would have during lockdown, away from sort of the classroom distractions in a way, that they've actually been able to focus more. Sometimes having parents there on hand has been helpful in terms of encouragement, focus. There's been very much this recognition that all assessments are now important. So whereas before we would have students who would sort of go through the year with this, oh, it'll be all right, I'll just revise, 3 weeks before the exams, I'll pick everything up attitude. They've really realised how important every assessment is. We've noticed their smaller assessment marks have picked up. On the other side, we've had the students who haven't engaged very well with the online offering at all. We've been quite lucky in terms of, we don't have a huge range of the disadvantaged students. Most of our students have had access to the technology. Most of our students have had access to decent-ish internet. We've had one or two who've needed a bit of support where they've logged off, but we do recognise we have been incredibly lucky with our cohort. So we've taught pretty much a full timetable. Our students have covered. They've logged. The only changes we really made, other than obviously being online, was their lessons went from an hour down to 50 minutes to give them 10-minute off-screen time between lessons. But other than that, our lessons have followed pretty much a similar structure, with the absence, obviously, of practical work. Again, what we have done when we've come back is we've really prioritised those year groups. We've put in practical blocks. because of not being able to share equipment between bubbles, not being able to share safety. So we've gone for each student. So we've had a year 12 block where they've put their own safety glasses in a Ziploc bag, and they've had that, and every lesson has been practical for 2 weeks. And then they've been decontaminated over the weekend, move on to another year group. And we've worked like that sort of since we came back. So that's been positive. Actually quite enjoyed the comeback and the break that the practical little block has given them. So that's been useful. Definitely, as Leah was saying, lots of anxiety while these. I said, while they realise all the assessments are important, and that's been good in terms of encouraging them to revise throughout the course. Very, very anxious, very sort of, is this going to be used? Will you look at this? Can I do this? How can I improve? And I think for us, a lot of that has been caused by sort of the delay in information coming out from Ofqual and the exam boards. We are in a bit of an odd position in we being in Wales, but still having access to English exam boards. So our students are doing a mixture. Chemistry, we follow OCR, but for maths, biology and physics, they follow WJC. So they're very much caught in that world of, well, in these subjects, they have to do this subject, we're doing it this way. And I think that's been quite disconcerting for them, having different rules. The biggest issue that I found for me personally has been that this idea of what Ofqual have said that we can use and what OCR have said we can use in terms of assessments. I would have been very happy to give them grades following the same process as last year, give them a grade, rank them, have some moved up and down. And that we were happy to do that last year, that would have worked this year. What we're finding now is students where you're teaching, the whole point of testing it during the year is to highlight misconceptions that you can then go in and address. So we make our tests hard. We deliberately put in questions we think are going to catch them out because we want to have a chance to address those. They learn from doing those assessments. And now we're being told, oh no, you can't take into account progress if whatever they got on that is going to represent their mark. I've now had to set a test with a completely different sort of emphasis on in terms of seeing what they can do rather than highlighting misconceptions. We've been told from OCR we can only use past papers from 2017 to 2019. So now what we're finding, I think this may impact when they go to university, is that our students, because they know what past papers the assessment materials are coming from, they're not learning the content, they're learning the past papers. So they're not learning how to name a particular chemical. They're going, yes, that was because this was on this paper. And that's really demoralizing. As teachers, we want them to, we encourage them to use past papers all the time. We go back to 2001. We go back to older legacy courses. We do every example we can find. And that's how we encourage them to revise. But that's to understand the chemistry and to look at mark schemes and to think, what terminology do I need to know? Not, the answer to the Hess law question in 2017 was minus 563, which is the way they're revising now. And it's, demoralizing as a teacher that they're now learning answers, not developing understanding.
No, that's brilliant, Hannah. Thank you. Leah, I saw you nodding your head a lot through that presentation. Is there anything you'd like to add back to that as a response to what Hannah said?
It just made me think actually that when I first put the slide together, it was based more on the generic problems that we're going to face. But actually, as Hannah said, there's a whole raft of other things that have come up recently. So the students are indeed doing exactly that. They know that certain assessments are going to be used, so they're going and finding the answers. And I had to speak to my year 13s this morning about that wasn't the point, that this subject has value in and of itself. And we were never just teaching you for an exam, but actually that's become a fight now for us to explain that we were finishing the course. And of course, there is that problem, as Hannah said, that some schools may have gone, well, actually, we've decided we're just not going to finish this particular course. I told all of my scientists, and that's across the board, biology, chemistry, physics, that, as I say, our subjects have worth in and of themselves. Therefore, they finished the course, all of them. Everything was taught. We didn't miss anything out. But some schools went with the line of, actually, we don't have to teach you this bit, so that's the end of that. And that means they are going to have gaps in their knowledge. They've also got a very unhealthy relationship with those assessments now and what they think an assessment is for. And so, yeah, there are the whole other set of issues that we're now hitting, and it is going to be a struggle in terms of getting them back on board with just learning and what the point of learning is, and the fact that they should love the learning for itself, not for particular grades they're trying to achieve.
So really interesting, actually ties in with some of the things that the third presenter, who's unfortunately is unable to make it now today, has actually said. So if I just read what this teacher's provided me with, and then maybe we could come back again to some of the discussions. He said, "Hi Nigel, sorry I can't be there today, but I've summarised my thoughts for you. Some negatives first, and then I'll finish on a positive. Transition for 2021 students is likely to be harder than for the 2020 students, as they face 2 years of disruption and miss more face-to-face teaching than first-year students. Some students will have missed part of the course due to illness or self-isolation, which may well result in knowledge or skill gaps and a lack of perceived confidence in their own ability compared to peers. Different experiences across different schools, but practical work has been quite heavily disrupted here. Try to adapt with home experiments and simulations, but it's just not the same. It's not just the hands-on skills they will be lacking, but also the data collection and analysis, group work, things like that. And as a result, they seem to have very low confidence in their own ability. Teacher-determined grades, so students may not have as much experience of sitting formal exams. Students also worry that the teacher-assessed grades will not be as valued in the same way as traditional exams. We have also been told as a school not to teach any new topics and to focus solely on knowledge consolidation. So if this is common across the country, then there may be differences in topics that students will have covered." Sorry, that's all rather negative, but let's end on something a bit more upbeat. Students will likely be much more comfortable with digital resources and online learning, and in some cases will be better prepared to work independently and manage their own time as a result of the lockdowns. Last year's Year 13s were very uncomfortable using Zoom, whereas this year's Year 13s are much more willing to have cameras on and engage with me as a teacher. Students will be comfortable using online tools, simulations, etc. And in some cases, this will have a better, and in some cases, they will have a better understanding of topics covered by these tools as a result. Don't know whether Leah or Hannah, if you have got anything that you'd like to say to that. Is there anything there that specifically jumps out, or you feel you could expand on from your position as teachers?
I think, as Leah was saying, it's this disparity in the content, and we very similarly decided that as chemistry teachers we could not allow our students to go to university not being able to do NMR and certain topics. There were things that we've decided not to assess, but they have finished the course. And I think for me, what's been frustrating through all this is, yes, we know that some schools haven't been able to teach online. We recognise we're lucky in that sense. We lost very little teaching time. Whenever our year groups are isolating, they were taught online. We've had 100% live taught, live delivered through Teams or through Zoom, So yes, we've been lucky there. But those students have also worked hard. They haven't just had that knowledge dumped into their heads. And we have students whose friends at other schools were out playing or weren't working during lockdown, whereas ours were. And I find it really frustrating that, yes, there are students who through no fault of their own haven't had the teaching that ours have had. But those students, there'll also be students in those schools whose parents went and got them a revision guide, who made them sit and work. And I don't think it's fair to assume that our students have had an easy ride just because we finished the course. They have done the work, and they will leave knowing more chemistry than other students getting the same grades. And we're finding it hard to rationalise how are other schools assessing. As Leah said, some schools are just assessing certain topics, some schools are doing exams, some schools are doing classwork assessments, and we feel that we want to be consistent. We don't want to give our students a greater advantage, but we don't want to disadvantage them. And we don't, ours have done whole past papers. We can give them a grade based on full papers, marked with mark schemes, marked with the grade boundaries. We can say pretty certainly this is what they would have got. Whereas down the road, they might be testing, some 3AS topics. And I think that would be difficult for me if I was in your position with students coming in and you look at their grade profile and just being aware that two A's or two B's or may not be equivalent to each other.
I think it's a similar thing again. I know we had the discussion in school as to what the best way round it was, and obviously how we did it the first year. And that's the problem, isn't it? Even within school, so even within my department, where we tried to be fair to everybody and follow all the guidance, you've got a massive disparity now between how we were asked to do it last year and how we're being asked to do it this year, which means, of course, that how you've come up with a grade is different year on year between two year groups. And that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem across the board now, because as much as they've asked for consistency, they've changed the way they want us to do things. Inevitably, it's not going to lead to consistency, and different schools are interpreting that advice in different ways. As I said, you've got schools who have definitely gone, well, we don't need to teach anything else. That's the end of that chapter. And I know, like within our school, we've got departments who certainly made that choice and said that's it. Whereas obviously we as a team for science have said that no, that we don't just teach for exams. We teach because we think our subjects are valuable, and therefore the students should have that information before they leave. And that's what we've done with year 11 and with year 13. But of course, that's a knock-on effect for us, because as they come into sixth form, they're going to have differing year 11 experiences, and it's a knock-on effect for you guys, because obviously they're going to have such massive differences. And of course, while they were here, and as and as Hannah was saying, as they were here, they might have been in bubbles that got sent home for 3 weeks. So it's not just the lockdowns, it's also the fact they may not have been, there are some students who may have had a ridiculously minimal amount of time actually in the building anyway. And they may have engaged, like my year 13s were one of my best classes online, to be fair. They did engage. I know there's been a question in the chat. They did engage, but it did take a lot of work. And it is obviously a very different forum to the kind you get in a classroom. So you're still going to have gaps and areas where you won't pick up on things as quickly as you would in a classroom, where you have that free time to talk to them about things. So yeah, I do think it's a large concern, the teacher assessed grades and how that's going to go, and the consistency across the UK.
Can I just jump into you're saying about different year groups having different experiences? And I think there has been this perception that the return to school has fixed everything. And for me, it definitely hasn't, because we're now, 2 meters away, unless you're to do practicals. I mean, mask, visor, PPE, walking around the room, which isn't feasible every lesson. So I feel more disconnected, and I don't feel, when people are saying, oh, great, schools are reopened back to normal, coming back to COVID safe teaching is very different to coming back to wandering around. I used to I'd grab a group of students, sit in amongst them, have a couple on either side, we'd sit down, we'd work together. I can't do that from 2 meters away. And in some ways, I find that maybe online was better, because online I could set up individual Zoom calls or individual Teams calls and have one-to-one chats. I can't have a one-to-one chat 2-3 meters away across the room, and they go, sorry, no, I can't come and look at you, and unless you write it massive on a whiteboard. Or I've started in the classroom, I'm even saying, well, actually, if you Teams call me on your iPad, hold your iPad over your work so I can see it, because otherwise I still can't actually get there physically to do that real time there on the spot feedback. So I think the return to school has sort of been overhyped as being back to normal. It's really not.
Thank you. That's really bad. Michael, I think, summed it up perfectly with his comment. He said sobering but really valuable. Thank you. We have had quite a number of questions that have come through in the chat, and if anyone has got more questions, please post them as we're going through. But I'll just go down the list as they appear. So Ian's asked, what do you think are the key skills that year 13 pupils have been unable to experience, and how can we help them with the transition to higher education?
In some ways, I think our students will be better. They now do learn independently. They're more able to log on, find books, find resources. So in some ways, having learned at home and having more of a lecture style almost approach, some of them, not all, may actually be more used to that now when they come to university. So that I'd be interested to have some feedback on actually whether that turns out to be the case.
Yeah, so similarly, I'd say that they're independent learning, and in fact, to such an extent that I was able to set some tasks that are quite high level, quite challenging, and probably wouldn't have had time to do in the classroom. I've been able to send them away and go, well, have a look at this data. This is real data. Now go and do something with it, and then give me back the response. I think the only problem and my only concern there is that's been really positive, but not every student, it's that gap again, not every student has done that. So they do seem to be better at independent learning. They have got used to the lecture styles of delivery, and they are good with the technology. So that is going to be a massive positive. It is just, again, it's the gap. It's the fact that not all of them have engaged in the same way. And I think therefore their speaking and listening and their social skills and their ability in a classroom are the areas that are going to be weaker.
Is there anything specific, technical skills more from the scientific perspective that you think we may need to scaffold as well, as opposed to sort of the more social aspects?
Yeah, so I think, as I said from my first point, the issue is that normally we wouldn't run one practical and then never look at that equipment again. We'd have done a practical of a similar, serial dilutions, titrations. You don't do them once, you do them multiple times, so that by the time they leave and they get to university, hopefully someone says, this is a serial dilution, they go, okay, they carry on. And because they've got the technical proficiency, they can think about what they're doing. And that's where we're aiming for in year 13. They should be able, obviously with AQA and the CPAC and how we're assessed, they should be able to exhibit all of those 5 skills. So the ability to follow a method, the ability to choose equipment, the ability to risk assess their own practicals and reference things, all of those things should be in place. But because they haven't had that opportunity to become technically proficient with each area, they're still at the stage where you have to remind them how to use things. And so we just haven't built those skills in. So whereas before, hopefully you'd send them away and they'd know their way around a lab, basically, and how to use the basic equipment, how to do the basic processes, and therefore how to think critically. And as the other teacher mentioned, be able to analyse the data and focus on those things. They haven't had that practice. There's just not a proficiency there. They know about it, but it's a concept. It's not something that's actually a learned skill.
So in that respect, if there was one thing that you could advise us as universities to do for when students actually arrive in October, what would you suggest?
I think for some of them, as we said, there's a potential that some of them may not have been in a lab for 2 years. That's the worst case scenario. And obviously it won't be that way for the vast majority, but that is a possibility. I think if they have the opportunity to refamiliarise themselves with the key pieces of equipment, the key processes, the key ideas in a lab, and just it's building that confidence, isn't it? Because I know that me personally, as a teacher, I always look at it from the perspective of when I was in sixth form, we did no practical work. Therefore, when I went to university, I was really hesitant with everything. I didn't want to touch anything. I didn't want to break anything. I didn't want anything to go wrong. And so for my students, I make sure that even though we're a community school, we manage to give them all these different opportunities to trial the equipment and build their confidence, because if they're not confident in it, then they won't try things and they won't explore, and therefore they won't learn. They'll be too worried about what they're doing. So if you could just have something where it's building those practical skills and building their confidence, I think.
Alexandra asked, how have students been engaging with the online lectures? Did they ask questions? I think you've covered parts of this, but my friends sort of gave me this information about sort of the current year 13s are perhaps a little bit more willing and able to engage with the with online lectures. Has that been your experience over the last couple of years? I mean, Hannah, if we come to you first.
I put some comments in the chat. We've sort of used different tools. So we found things like Slido, Poly, really useful. We discovered a website called whiteboard.fi, which allows students to draw on their screen in real time and you can see what they're drawing. So we try to incorporate things like that as much as possible into the lessons. We've also been we're a Microsoft school, so we've been using the class notebook as part of OneNote in Microsoft Teams. And one of the things that allows you to do, again, very quickly, is to share. The students have a notebook that teachers can access live. So I was actually able to I was trying to replicate this going around the classroom and live marking that we couldn't do. But that did allow me to do that. I still can now. If they're working in that notebook, I can see what they're doing and I can mark their work live and give them real-time feedback. And having those tools, I think, made a huge difference. We also had a cameras on rule, which I know some schools said no, but was sort of the opposite. But we actually said no. We said they could use backgrounds, the background filter and that kinds of things. But unless there was a good reason their cameras were on, they had to explain to their head of year why their camera wasn't on. So there was quite a lot of backup there in terms of you will be here. We took registers, we chased absences, and they were expected to be in lessons as they would have been in the school day. But definitely having those tools, I said the Slido and the whiteboard and the OneNote were really helpful in making them engage. I also did a lot of shared PowerPoint, so create a PowerPoint. They all have access to the same PowerPoint, give them a slide each, and they worked on a slide, and I could scroll up and down and see what they were doing. So it was very much, once you found ways to check they were engaging, then they would, because you could call them out on it and say you haven't done anything yet. But without that, there was the tendency to slip back. So I think that using those tools made them engage.
And do you think perhaps that's also because they know that you're going to be judging their work and ultimately deciding what their grade is?
I think for the students we have, just the potential of an email going home was enough. But yeah, I'm sure as time's gone on, grades definitely have become more a topic of conversation. But I think most of our students, I think, if there's that check there, they'll do it. They'll try and have a bit of an easy time if they can. But as soon as they can see you're looking, they pretty much want to do what's expected, and then they'll step up.
Leah, has that been your experience as well, or have you had something different to that?
Ours was slightly different. So obviously we had the big discussion, and our safeguarding lead came down on the side of no cameras, which obviously means that that's great for safeguarding, but it's not great for you being able to see what they're doing. So we did, for the most part, Year 13 were engaged, and again we use Microsoft Teams. I use the chat function a lot, so PowerPoint on screen and delivery, and then asking lots and lots of questions, and the chat function was on so I could see what they were all answering. And then you can still target questions, you can still get questions from them. Lots and lots of positives that we got from that. And obviously we did exactly the same. We had a system of monitoring whether they'd given their work in, whether they're engaging, whether they're turning up to lessons. We took registers. So all of that kind of helped. It just, again, there were 90% of the students engaged that way, but there was those 10% who didn't. And obviously they're going to be the ones that will have the biggest problem moving forwards.
Ian's asked that, do you have any insight on what pupils may expect from a science university course based on the mostly negative media about online teaching? Do you think perceptions changed amongst your students about what they can expect from a degree at university?
We had, we've done some higher ed events the past few times. We've had some current university students come in and talk about their experiences, and most of them have been quite positive. So one student was saying she really likes online the sort of video pre-recorded lectures, because she can go back and re-watch things. She said she's not a morning person, so she schedules her lectures when she wants them. But also, if there's something that she hasn't understood, she'll pause the lecture, go and look it up, come back, and once she's then sorted that issue, carry on and watch the rest of the lecture. So but the students that we've had have actually been quite positive. So I wonder if that's something that maybe you could be flagging up if there's still the same situation in September, is saying, now look, having online having these pre-recorded lectures can actually be useful. And I think when I think back to my being at university, I think I would have quite liked to have pressed pause in the middle of a lecture and gone and looked things up and come back. So maybe just explaining to them those benefits, or even, I don't know if they can have how it's all working, but if they're in friendship groups, they could sit down 3 or 4 of them, watch a lecture, and then you could have that discussion in that group while they're watching the lecture. It could actually be quite positive. They might just need to have that explained to them and sold to them a little bit at the start of the year.
Yeah, I think the opinion amongst the students is certainly my students are very open. They'll tell me if there's a problem, and certainly they haven't said anything negative. I know there's been things in the media, but it's not been something that they brought into the classroom, and normally it is. If it's something they're thinking, I'll hear about it. But actually, yeah, as we said, I think they now understand that online lectures can work. They understand how it works. I think once they get past, I think for some of them it was they were less confident in speaking, because obviously everyone can see the chat. So obviously that student in the classroom who just won't respond until you go and talk to them, which obviously you can't do now because you're 2 meters away. But that student took a little bit longer to engage, but I think they do see the value in it, and they definitely did appreciate the videos. They appreciated the recordings. They appreciated being able to go back through things. So I think mostly that's a positive side of it. The online learning shouldn't be a problem for most of our students.
David's asked, do you think we will end up with two types of students, those that have had access and are intrinsically motivated, and those that didn't have access and are extrinsically motivated? He said, in the past, my first year lectures were criticised by the students as covering too much of the old A-level content. It now seems that this is more better placed.
I think it's interesting. I think if I'm honest, I think part of the answer to that is that hopefully when they've come back in and we've had that time with them, we've worked to try and make sure that isn't the case. So as I say, my year 13 this morning and my year 13 when we came back, it was very much, this is what we're doing, but I'm never going to do this and not explain to you why we're doing this. We are finishing the content, but this is why we're finishing the content. This is the value of this subject. And I think it's important. You're always going to have those students who are in the course, in the class on that particular university course because their parents want them to, or because that particular job is what they've been sold on by somebody, and therefore they're not there for the right reasons. I'm not sure that at the moment I'd say that the reasons have changed much. I think those kids who want to do well are doing well and trying, and those who are a little more cynical are still cynical. I haven't seen personally a massive shift in that, if I'm honest.
I would sort of ask, hasn't it always been that way? Wouldn't you always have had some students who are intrinsically and some extrinsically motivated, some who've had different levels of teaching, different levels of access? I think what the pandemic has done is bring those differences to light rather than and possibly exacerbate them in some ways, but I think those differences have always been there. I think, it's maybe been overhyped. I can't imagine, I would imagine students without access to technology would always have suffered at A level. I can't imagine handwriting everything as opposed to typing everything. Same with the motivation. I just think those differences have always been there.
Question from McClure is, how can we show students the inherent value in developing skills for independent study, and how can we best support students to develop these skills? And if you've got any thoughts on that, was that something they are developing better this year, do you think?
So I can give an example of this one, I think, where we've shifted as a school from sort of telling them they need to revise to actually explicitly teaching them metacognition and retrieval practice. And the way that we've done that is to every so often have these retrieval practice questions. So you teach a lesson, you have retrieval practice questions, you teach the next lesson, you have the same retrieval practice questions. They all do so much better, and you go, ta-da. They really need to be shown how it works. I mean, that sounds really simplistic, but it is exactly what we've done. It's just to show them that actually, for the reasons I've said, that we know this happens as A-level teachers, you know it happens as lecturers, that if you have the ability to go through, say, the practical skills to get to proficiency, you can then stop worrying about what you're doing technically and think about, well, why have I done that step? Why do I need to do this before I do that? What is the point of this? What's the aim of this practical? Whereas when we start with them in year 12, you're forever going to them, yes, but what is the aim of this practical? What are you actually trying to achieve? Don't tell me what you're doing with a pipette. Why are you using a pipette in the first place? And actually that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of confidence building in terms of those skills. So I think they have to have that practice and that ability, but it's just explaining to them the rationale. I mean, that's how we've always done it, is just to say, we're not asking you to do this for fun or because we like watching you struggle through practicals. We're asking you to do this because actually once you get to that stage where it's no longer something you think about, you can actually start to contemplate the rationale for the whole practical. You can start to think through your understanding of why bits work. There is a reason for it, basically. So just always explicitly teach them the reason you're doing something.
Hannah, have you got anything you could add to that?
Not really, only that it may turn out that maybe some of the students who haven't had access to the online learning may turn out to be better in terms of the independent skills. So you may find you have students with better science knowledge, but not so good with the independent learning where they have been taught online normal lessons. And then you may have students who've covered less of the course, slightly weaker in their science knowledge, but then have had to do it all themselves. So in terms of independent learning skills, will be outperformed. So just that they may not necessarily be the better independent learning skills going with the better science knowledge.
I've got a couple of questions that come through me in private messages. Do you think that the teacher-determined grades will be a fair reflection of student ability? I mean, as teachers, are you going to feel pressurised by students and or parents to award the highest grades possible? I don't know if that's a bit of a loaded question, but I don't know if you do have any feelings on that.
Yeah, I do, certainly, because I talk to the students about this a lot. I think the problem here is that there is no way to ensure consistency across every teacher in every school. I know they're going to try to, but I think it's very difficult. I know personally, will I bow down to pressure from anybody? No, because as I've always told the students, we're scientists, we go from data. Here is your data. This is how your grade was determined. This is what it's come from. Nobody can argue with that, because if you've got a spreadsheet full of evidence and you can explain why you've weighted something differently to something else, and there you can say, well, actually, here are all 34 students. This is why they got their grade. This is where it's come from. Then actually, there shouldn't be any wiggle room at all, should there? It should be as simple as that. Here is our evidence. It is valid because, but it's that really. It's the case of, have people picked valid assessments? How are they doing this? What are they basing it on? And then, as you say, unfortunately, I'm not going to pretend to be naive enough to think that everybody across the UK is going to do that. They're not. Some people are going to give grades that are not reflective of students' ability. I know that, as heartbreaking as it is, because I always tell my students, obviously, if it was just up to me in terms of you just get A stars, wouldn't you? But it's not about that. And I always say to them, what do you think is going to happen if I do that? I do that, AQA come in, they go, I don't think so. So I always, again, it's the rationale. I always explain to them, this is why we're doing this. It has to be fair. It has to be valid. You can't all get A stars. That's not how this is going to work. It's not how it's going to go down, because they do pressure you. And you feel, I mean, you have such a relationship with your A-level students that you feel awful for them. You know, if you know that eventually they are going to end up with a teacher assessed grade of a D, that feels awful. For them to get that in an exam is one thing. For you to have awarded it to them is an entirely different thing. And the guilt for that, I don't think they've thought about. But in terms of will that change my decision-making process? No, because it should all be based on the evidence. But as I say, that won't be the way everybody approaches it, I'm afraid.
Similarly, I think it's the worry for me is not knowing what other schools are doing. I don't think, well, I assume there will be pressure, but we're not going to bow to the pressure. We think the students will have grades that they deserve. If anything, I'm worried that we'll end up giving them higher grades than they deserve, not because we've been pressured into it, but the way that Ofqual have told us we have to assess. Limiting the numbers. When it first came out, and Boris stood up and said, we're going into lockdown again and schools are closing. Oh, by the way, no exams. We assumed it might be similar to last year. We could use evidence. We could use real assessments. Ideally, I would have taken questions off a huge range of past papers. Ofqual came out and said, okay, we're going to release packs for each topic. You can tell students what topic they're being tested on, but not which question. And we thought, okay, great. So they're probably going to release, 20 of this question, and we'll be able to pick one. And we thought, that seems fair. They can revise the 20. They can do that. They'll do the one. They won't know what it was, but to be able to answer it, they would have to have learned the topic. This is fine. This is good. And then they come out and say, well, actually, we're only going to use these 3 years papers. They release to students which papers they're using. They've released the questions to students. So if we now say you're being tested on arenes, the students will look at the grid and they'll say, so really, that's either the question from the 2018 question or the 2019 paper, and I can go and learn those. So what I worry about now is that we're going to end up rewarding the learners, not the understand and appliers, which to me is a key part of science, is that taking something and applying it, which the old A star used to be good at discriminating. You couldn't get to the A star unless you could do those hard application questions. But now they're not. Now you can get an A star by being a solid sit-home learner. And that doesn't sit right with me. I feel you should be able to get to a C or a B by being your solid sit-down, learn facts. But you need to be able to do that application. That to me, that's what the A and the A star mean. And I can't say that's not what we're testing. And that's not what we want. Ideally, if it was me, I would have at least changed the questions. I'm absolutely astounded that Ofqual didn't, at least, from a chemistry perspective, why didn't they just stick some methyl groups on all over the molecule? Same question, just make it look different. From a physical chem perspective, or applied to physics, they could have given the paper and changed the numbers. At least they would have had to have learned how to do that question then, not learn that the answer's 48. And we're being told to do that by Ofqual. And I feel completely undermined in terms of my professional standards, and then much lower than that is what Ofqual are saying to us to do. And I think grades will go up, and I think, but it's not through teachers' fault, and it's not by parents pressuring us, and it's not us bowing in. It's us thinking, well, sorry, but this is what Ofqual have told us to do. And that's where the parent pressure comes from. Because if I turn around now to my students and say, well, we're going to test, we're going to give you a full paper, they'll say, but that's not what, because the parents have the Ofqual guidance, and they will say, that's not what you've been told to do. If I say I'm going to edit this paper, so I'm going to take questions from different papers and put them together and change the numbers and change the molecules, they'll say, but you've been told you can only use the 27 to 19 papers. Why are you disadvantaging my child against another school? So I think there will be the grades will be, not necessarily say not deserved, but they won't reflect ability accurately. But I don't think that's to do with teachers. I think that's the system that's been forced on us. Sorry, rant over.
I think that's really important that we understand that, and it's quite sobering, really. I think David put a comment in there. It's about it's refreshing that you have the same views as us in terms of grading and making connections with students and things, and so that's something that really we do need to consider. Nicola's put a question in the chat. So, do you have any insights on parents' expectations of higher education? I've seen that means what their kids are going to get as a higher education experience. Nicola, I don't know if you want to unmute and maybe expand on that.
Yeah, so exactly as you say, so about kind of what kind of experience their children are going to be able to expect from higher education. I know that we've had interactions from parents who said, my children are teaching themselves, and it's like, well, they're not teaching themselves, but we are, expecting them to be able to learn more independently at this level, and they're not able to make that distinction.
Possibly no more insights than you've shared there. I mean, the only insights we have are from students or parents who've come back and said similar things, and we go, yes, this is university. I mean, I've heard scare stories, I don't know, you might say whether this is true, of parents phoning up lecturers and saying, oh, she's been really ill lately, and trying to get involved, which I find quite worrying.
Yes, we have seen that, and I share your concern.
But yeah, I don't think I could share any more insights than you have yourself, other than we are fully on your side. We're certainly not encouraging them to think that university is going to be like school, but I mean, we see it with the sort of, maybe at our level it is encouraged a bit more. We do, we still write home to parents even though they're nearly 18 and say, oh, there's 3 homeworks missing and sort of thing. But parents I don't think seem to get that jump, maybe as well as they should.
I think similar thing. I think interestingly, the students themselves are familiar because we do a lot of work with them. I know my school does, and I'm sure most schools do, in terms of sixth form, to make sure that they understand it is a different structure. And I know it's certainly something I talk about with my students personally. So I'd say that most of the students are familiar with the fact they have to be independent learners, because it's one of the things that we say to them. This is why you need to learn this. The rationale is you will have to use it later on as well as here. Whether the parents do or not is always a different question. So I think students, yes, they are familiar with the concept. But yeah, parents, it's a little bit different, isn't it? They've been used to that level of contact, and we still have parents' evenings. We still do, as Hannah said, contact home. If they haven't handed in homework or, something quite minor, is still something we would contact them for. So I think for parents, maybe it's a good point. Maybe it's something that we should be getting them together and explaining to them as well. That there is a difference between you need to expect that difference.
Something I wanted to ask actually is the longer term implications of this. You both touched on this in terms of GCSE students, but if you've got years 7, 8, 9 coming through who've not done any practical work at all, when they finish their GCSEs, are they going to be going into A levels from a significantly lower starting point? And is this going to be something that's going to have an impact not just on the current sort of A level students going through, but a much longer term implication that we're going to need to consider, do you think?
So I think we've already started talking about when potentially the bubbles will be burst, and yes, they are calling it that. So when the bubbles burst, hopefully, and it's our problem, basically. So when the bubbles burst, we then have to deal with, I mean, if you've got year 7, obviously they haven't had that first year, which is so important. And just to put it in context, one of my year 7s today went, "What's a Bunsen burner?" And that just hurts me, if I'm honest, because that's for every sort of secondary school science teacher, that's one of the first lessons they have. You take them into a lab, you explain that this is not a normal room, you explain that this is very important safety information, and they get their little certificate for having learned how to use a Bunsen burner safely. So for them to be at the end of this year and not know what one is, or even what it looks like, because we're nowhere near the labs, is quite heartbreaking. But in terms of the bubbles bursting again, hopefully then what we do is we're just going to have to make up that deficit. We're going to have to make sure they do get that lab time, and we're going to have to make sure that any of those gaps we start to fill as best we can. Obviously, it will have a knock-on effect, but hopefully we can mitigate that slightly.
We're in a sort of slightly different position in being needing to justify our fees, to put it bluntly. So we, after year 11 left last year, and obviously they're missing the whole of the summer term, and the questions were, well, what are you doing with them for this term? And we said, well, we wouldn't normally be doing it. We'd normally revise and they'd go off and do exams. But there was this pressure from parents for there to be teaching during that summer term. So we put in place what we called our ARCH pro. It was a step up to A-level program. So our year 11 students in that summer term in lockdown last year completed step up to, so only in the subjects they were going to take for A-level, they complete. So we put in mostly skills-based things that would help, things that would sort of help them through A-level. And that was sort of about an 8-week program that they did. So they were in some ways then have actually been better prepared coming into A-level. We're doing something similar-ish with year 13. We put some lectures in. We were worried that they'd just be out of the habit of learning, because obviously normally you'd revise for exams and you'd have those revision habits, those study habits that they would take with them into university. So we were worried that just not revising for exams would be detrimental to them, just being out of those study habits. So we put in random sort of beyond A-level lectures. We did some preparing for real life lecture, how to fix your car and just how to cook a meal on a student budget and things like that. So they had some form of provision. Obviously now parents have caught on to this, and therefore we have to do it this year again because it was such a success last year, even though they haven't missed out as much. So we're now finding that maybe our A-level students are coming in a little bit more prepared, a little bit more knowing what the courses are going to be like, having done that little block of work at the end of year 11.
There's a question from Josie, which I think is actually more aimed at sort of the academics and the higher education academics in the room. So my worry is that actually we simply may not have time to bring students up to speed on things we expect them to know coming into the course, resulting in poor practical performances. Any thoughts on how we can collaboratively get around this? Any ideas of summer schools or similar being circulated? And that sort of feeds quite nicely into what you were just talking about, Hannah, and then sort of like a step up type program. Do you think it would be a good idea for us as universities to club together to try and provide some additional training for students in that gap between leaving school at the end of the exams and starting? Would there be appetite for students to do something like that, do you think?
I think from my students, there'd definitely be appetite there. I do sort of have to question how much of that would be an addition to what's already out there. And again, are we sort of developing these spoon feed, give me stuff students? I think I can see the comments just come up in the chat from David about MOOCs. And yet I think this is an argument we made when we were being asked to prepare this, is you're asking us as A-level teachers to do lectures on topics that, okay, we know about, but we're not lecturers, we're not university lecturers, we've been asked to do sort of beyond what we'd normally do. And there are, go on YouTube, go on edX, go on FutureLearn, that there are things out there. And I think, it would be a great, I don't know if it'd be something you could then tailor towards your courses that you would do as a university yourself, that was tailored to what you look for. But I would be wary of sort of asking you to duplicate what's already out there when there is so much out there. Maybe it's just a list of YouTube things or a list of books that they could access might be a more productive use of your time than asking you to produce those things. But yes, I think if you did, it would be sort of well received.
Yeah, I think so. Very similar. I think the students would appreciate it, but again, yeah, they do at some point have to step up to being independent learners. I think gaps in their sort of practical skills, those kind of things, they certainly aren't their fault. So that would probably be a better thing to cover. But obviously, you guys all know for your particular courses what would be best. There are so many things though, and I know that some of my A-level students took Future Learn courses, so they're also familiar with that concept. A lot of students. And yeah, there is just so much out there now. There are so many things they can do. It's almost too much to pick from rather than not enough. So
perhaps signposting and providing guidance on what is the best resources that they can make their use of would be a better use of our time rather than to, I suppose, for want of a better word, reinventing the wheel and producing it all ourselves, do you think?
Yeah, and we did a very similar thing with the Step Up to A-Level, where Year 11 each had a separate team for the course they wanted to join, and they were given transition activities, and it was a case of, we wrote things like careers and a reading list and all the sort of things that we want them to know, but it was also a lot of signposting to go here, look at this, learn how to do this, here's a great video on this. It wasn't a lot of personal teacher time involved in that. It was more about just showing them what there is out there already.
Leah, you put a comment up about if people wanted the perspective of somebody who's been managing a wholly online provision. So I don't know if you want to jump in on anything, if you got any comments of what you think we could be doing, or
I don't know how useful my insights would be because it's specifically international students. So just to give a bit of context, I manage the science and engineering programme for a college. In normal times, we have students come to the UK. It's a foundation provider, and then students progress to various different universities around the UK. And in general, the students are very successful doing that. But what we've had to do, we've had to flip very quickly, initially into a hybrid delivery. So we had some students came to the UK in September, so they were given a kind of flip learning kind of approach in the UK with some live lessons in person, but as has been said, socially distanced. We couldn't access labs because we use our partner university labs, and they wouldn't let anybody in who weren't their own students. So we lost all access to labs entirely this whole academic year. We've also had students the whole year studying 100% online, and they're studying in every country from as far west as the west coast of the United States and Latin America, all the way over to Korea in +9 time zones. We've had to manage teaching across time zones as well. The one thing I'd say is our students have found it really, really helpful to have pre-recorded lecture content and to have asynchronous learning options. So we decided in the past we've done 5 hours per subject of live teaching. We've decided to split it up this year, and we've had 2 hours of live online classroom time and 2 hours asynchronous lesson time plus an online lecture. So that meant it wasn't as difficult to teach across the time zones. Having the opportunity for students to have material recorded, all of our live lessons are recorded as well, the ones that are held in online classrooms. So even the students who were doing live lessons in the UK face to face, they still had the option to go back and watch a live lesson from an online classroome. We're using a platform called Bongo Learn because of issues with getting past the Great Firewall of China and other restrictions. It's also worth HE establishments realizing that there are a lot of internet blocks in a lot of countries. So for example, YouTube is completely blocked in China. We found it very difficult to find a lab simulation provider that could get past all of these different firewalls. So we're using Labster, online lab simulations, to provide our students with practical experience as best as we can. What we have found difficult is tracking students, so is tracking their progress. That has been difficult because students are doing things at all sorts of different times of the day and night, particularly asynchronous learning. So that has been very, very difficult for us to keep tabs on within our usual kind of 8 till 6 working day, because we've had to keep that 8 till 6 working day. It's contractual, so we haven't been able to expand that for staff, even those who wanted to. It's been a challenging year, but we've maintained all of our assessments as have been done before. The only difference being the exams, instead of being in person in a exam hall, they've been done online. So we're doing remotely proctored final exams. They're worth 70%, so the students will be monitored by their webcam, and any hand-drawn diagrams have to be held up to the camera before they're then photographed and imported into the exam. So our students are still doing all the same assessments that previous students would have done. So in terms of this kind of issue with A-level students, if they know what they're going to be assessed on in advance and those kinds, we haven't got that issue because we have no idea what the papers are going to be. All we know is it's going to cover everything from September till the end of the course, and that's the usual thing. You know, we've had fewer issues with non-submission of work this year, actually, interesting, when it comes to coursework. So the percentage hit rate of students submitting their coursework is much higher, whether it's because they've all got this habit of doing everything online and submitting everything to a VLE rather than just the odd thing in the year. So actually for us it's improved student submission rates of work as well. Our students seem to be actually quite happy with the online provision that we've been able to put in place. So I think our students might actually have, for once, a bit of an advantage over the UK students. Usually they come a little bit kind of behind because they haven't had as much practical experience in their home countries. They come and we find they're not able to use pipettes, you know, all that kind of thing, and we have to start from scratch. Whereas obviously a lot of British students also haven't had much practical opportunity this year as well. So the fact that our students have had to be so independent, working all sorts of different times of the day and night, I think has actually been very helpful for their independence and for their resilience as well.
Got one final question that was privately messaged to me, and that is really not so much about the technical skills and the knowledge that they're going to need when they come to university. How are students going to adapt socially, do you think, to the transition to higher education? I don't know if either of you could have talked to your students about this or have got any insight about what students who have gone to university this year feel. I don't know.
I think this comes down to an interesting one where obviously every student thinks it's just them. It's almost, it's a really strange situation, but you have to remind the entire class regularly for year 11, 13, 10, 9 that actually everybody's been through this. I think someone's put a comment about the idea that they're behind. Everybody's behind. Everybody is stressed out. So you have to kind of constantly remind them that this is not a unique situation, not in a bad way. You know, obviously they feel what they feel, but I think it's been quite isolating for a lot of them. So obviously those who had close friendship groups already, that was fine. But for some of my students, I think they found it hard socially coming back. I had one had a panic attack this morning about coming back into the room to sit with everybody else, purely because they hadn't been together for a while. And I think obviously with the way that university is set up with all these new people, there are going to be some students who find it difficult from the point of view of they haven't been around lots of people. Obviously most of our kids now are used to being in a much smaller bubble of students. They're not mixing with the whole school like they used to. So I think there are going to be those students who find it difficult, but as usual, there'll always be those students who actually are fine with.
Hannah, I don't know if you've got anything you could finally add to that.
Only really what we've seen where they've come back. So we had the 2 weeks in just before the Easter break. We allowed them some time. We made a decision to within each lesson we couldn't give them more free time because we couldn't have them wandering around the school. They had to be kept, keeping it in their bubbles. But we did make an effort to say within each lesson they could have some social time where they weren't being taught. During those 2 weeks, we called them like reconnect activities. So we try to again within their bubbles put on some fun things, so some social things. I'm not sure how it works with you. Obviously, we're not, once they're in school, they don't need to be 2 meters apart, and they sort of deem that as long as they're within that bubble, that's fine, which can be frustrating at times when we're thinking we don't actually want COVID ripping through the year group. But you know that they seem, the first day or two they were back maybe a little bit hesitant, but they seem to have fallen back into the routines. They have their study spaces, they have their own lunch times. They're a little bit frustrated that they're not always on break at the same time and things like that, but they seem to be coping with the social side. They seem to have just sort of gone back to, like they would after the summer holidays, I guess, just meeting up with people and falling back into those social routines.
I think I speak for everybody here when I say thank you so much for giving your afternoon up to come and speak to us. It's been incredibly valuable learning from your experiences, and it's been sobering but also quite positive as well in ways that we are going to be able to get through this. The students are going to be able to get through this, and it might just be a little bit more support needed at certain stages, and we just have to be understanding of that. But thank you so much for your time. It's been invaluable, and really are very, very grateful for you for giving that up. So thank you.